We've just about reached the halfway point of the fantasy football season, and the waiver wire is already looking a little thin. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there today, where we dive into the Week 8 waiver wire here for fantasy football. And yes, it's starting to get a little thin between some bad quarterback plays, some underperforming studs, and every damn player being injured. We're running out of viable names, but we got a few good ones we need to talk about here today. Now, just like we do every single week, I'm going to recap some of the top injuries from the past weekend, 5 things we learned from Week 7, the teams that are on upcoming bye. Then we'll go ahead and dive into the waiver wire, and I also have 5 players that I'm okay with dropping right now if you own them. But let's go ahead and start off first with some of the top injuries from this past weekend. The first name on the list is Jayden Daniels, and a lot of people want to know what is going to be the availability of Jayden Daniels going forward. He suffered a rib injury. Now, early tests show that there are no fractures, which is great, and his mom already came out and tweeted he's fine. Honestly though, do they rush him back? Do they give him a little bit of time? Do they even need him to win this week? We'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. Then we had Brandon Ayuk. He has torn his ACL. He is done for the year. How about Juju Smith-Schuster of the Kansas City Chiefs? He dealt with a hamstring spasm on Thursday when he was added to the practice injury report, and then he said he was good to go for Sunday. Apparently wasn't, because he went down early in that game with a hamstring injury. Aiden O'Connell, the quarterback of the Las Vegas Raiders, he suffered a broken thumb. He's going to miss 4 to 6 weeks. It's the return of the guard dog Gardner Minshew in Las Vegas. How about Tyler Huntley in Miami? He suffered a shoulder injury, but honestly, doesn't really matter when it comes to fantasy football, because Week 8, that's when Tua is supposed to return. How about Demario Douglas, wide receiver for the New England Patriots? He woke up sick in London on Sunday morning. He tried to play and really couldn't. He was actually seen getting an IV on the sidelines. He didn't help out a lot of people like we had hoped so. How about DK Metcalf? He suffered a knee injury, but it doesn't sound serious. He came down hard on his knee, and it looks like a potential bone bruise, but it's something to monitor here throughout the week. And then lastly, Deebo Samuel, another guy dealing with illness this past weekend. Actually saw him on the sidelines getting oxygen at one point, really prevented him from doing much of anything in Week 7. Is it something that lingers into Week 8? We'll talk about a few other options in San Francisco here in just a minute. But before we get into that, let's talk about 5 things we learned in Week 7 fantasy football. The first one being, the NFL injury reports are basically equal to single-ply toilet paper. I know it's frustrated, trust me. I get just as upset about it as you do. Heck, we even have people coming back and yelling at us for incorrect practice reports. Now, obviously, we can only go off of what is published. We're not sitting there with these guys and their doctors, but there's something we all need to remember. No matter how much we want these NFL teams to care about our fantasy football production or the bets we're making on a weekly basis, they do not care. They are out there playing chess. They are trying to deceive their opponent. In their mind, they can deceive their opponent all week long, thinking a player is limited but going to play, forcing their opponent to game plan for that player. Then, last minute, something happens, player can't go. Their opponents aren't going to have time to go out there and redo their entire game plan. Now, as much as that is irritating to me and I can't stand it either, it is what it is, so we gotta kind of get over it. Second thing, Kareem Hunt's usage could make him a league winner in 2024. He has 52 total touches over his last 2 games played. He's playing in Kansas City, where they continue to rack up injuries. Now, Juju is also hurt. And with Kareem Hunt averaging 23 touches per game, which is, yes, a career high, he's on pace for 1,300 total yards and 10 plus touchdowns, despite not even playing the entire season. For a guy that was a waiver wire ad for someone in your league, he could end up with a league winner. Next thing up, ugly football is going to be a weekly occurrence. Are you aware of the fact that almost 40% of the teams in the NFL right now have 2 wins or less? It has to do with bad quarterback play, dropped balls by wide receivers, numerous countless injuries, and weekly questionable coaching decisions that are leading to a lot of bad teams this year in the NFL. Now, there isn't really one thing that you can look at and point a finger at that this is the reason why it's happening. Personally, in my opinion, I think people are just trying to get a little bit too cute and going away from what really works. But a season like this is really going to make the NFL draft pretty interesting come 2025. Next thing up, Russell Wilson may look like an NPC, but he is going to revive George Pickens in Pittsburgh. In Wilson's first start as a Pittsburgh Steeler against a pretty good Jets defense, he found a way to unlock George Pickens and help open up that run game and give Najee Harris now back-to-back games with over 100 yards rushing. We've seen Russ have success down the field before with DK Metcalf in Seattle. With Cortland Sutton last year in Denver, we're probably going to see it again here with George Pickens now that Russell Wilson has taken over. So you may not enjoy his quirkiness, but you are going to enjoy the production that George Pickens and Najee Harris have rest of season. And then lastly, the tight end position is finally starting to come around a little bit. We actually had 8 tight ends in week 7 score at least 10 fantasy points, and we still have 4 teams to play tonight. Now, it wasn't a bunch of random tight ends that had good weeks either. All 8 of those tight ends that had 10 plus fantasy points were up inside my top 15 rankings in last week's show. And yes, that even includes Jonnu Smith in Miami. But bottom line, above all else, you gotta remember this game is meant to be fun. Don't let the frustrations of things that you can't control take away the fun from this game that it's supposed to bring you. Now, obviously, the majority of us are dudes and we're very competitive and we hate to lose. Trust me, I get that. But all you can do is make the best educated guesses that you can on a weekly basis. Whatever happens, happens. It's all about enjoying the ride. Now, we do have one thing going for us here in week 8. Typically, we cover right now the teams that are going on bye, but there are no teams on bye in week 8, so we should have everyone available. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the waiver wire now. Let's start off at the quarterback position. And right here at the top of the list, it has to be Tua Tagovailoa of the Miami Dolphins. He's only 46% owned, which I found a little bit odd, knowing that news came out almost a week ago saying that week 8 could be his date to return. This week, they got a matchup going up against Arizona, and it would be a great matchup for Tua to come back in. Arizona is among the top 10 teams in the NFL when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. Tua making his return with Tyreek and Waddle and Jonnu Smith and that running game and Odell Beckham. He has plenty of options to pick up where he left off. After him, we got to talk about Russell Wilson there in Pittsburgh. He's only 14% owned right now in a matchup going up against the New York Giants. And everyone wants to hate on Russ for his quirkiness, but his play shouldn't really shock a lot of people. Even last year in Denver, he threw for over 3,000 yards and had 29 total touchdowns last year. Now, no, he's not going to be some 5,000-yard passing quarterback that's going to throw 40 or 50 touchdowns. No, that's not going to be the case. But he's definitely going to give us the opportunity at more passing production in this Pittsburgh offense. After him, we go down to Bo Nix of the Denver Broncos, currently 23% owned in a matchup going up against Carolina, which is great. And there are a lot of Bo Nix haters out there, but the kid is actually playing pretty good. He's the current quarterback 13 overall right now in fantasy football, and he's averaging more fantasy points per game than Patrick Mahomes, Kirk Cousins, and Aaron Rodgers. Now he gets a matchup going up against Carolina. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and Bo Nix has had 60-plus rushing yards now in back-to-back ball games. So sure, his ceiling may not be overly high, but with that kind of rushing production, it definitely helps his floor weekly. Then when we add in a good matchup against Carolina, we could be looking at potentially one of those ceiling games. After him, we go down to Jameis Winston of the Cleveland Browns. He's got a matchup going up against Baltimore. No one really out there is owning Jameis Winston right now. But we know that Deshaun Watson tore his Achilles. DTR, he came in, he threw 2 picks and then left with a finger injury. And then Jameis Winston came into the ballgame and threw the only touchdown the Browns had all day long. Now they have a matchup going up against Baltimore. Baltimore is a lot easier to throw on than they are to run on, and we know that Jameis wants to come out there and sling the rock down the field. Now with no Amari Cooper in Cleveland, does he have enough weapons to really put up a huge game? If he did, I would probably rank him higher here on the waiver wire show. Given the fact that Elijah Moore and Jerry Jeudy are basically non-existent, there is some risk with Jameis Winston in that game against Baltimore. After him, we got Drake May going up against the New York Jets. He's currently 25% owned and really playing well here as of late. Over his last 2 games, he's had 519 yards passing, 5 touchdowns, and 56 yards rushing. Now, this matchup this week is going to be a lot more difficult against the Jets than it was last week against Jacksonville, But we did just see Russell Wilson throw the ball down the field somewhat successfully against this Jets defense. Really, when it comes to Drake May, it's the questions when it comes to the wide receiver group. They have a bunch of solid wide receivers, but they don't have that dude. And really, because of that, it's going to make it hard on Drake May each week, especially in tougher matchups, to have one of those ceiling type games. Now, hopefully Demario Douglas can come back and be a factor here in week 8. We'll see how that rolls out. Which then brings us to the last guy here on the list. It's Marcus Mariota of the Washington Commanders. 0% owned. Nobody owns him out there. He's available on your waiver wire, I'm sure. And he's going up against Chicago this week. Maybe. We don't even know for sure about Jaden Daniels as of yet. Now, a lot of people have come out this season and said that Jaden Daniels is just a system quarterback. He works in Washington. But then we saw Marcus Mariota come in and pretty much produce like Jaden Daniels was producing. 18 of 23 for 205 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, and then added in 34 yards rushing. But this matchup this week, going against Chicago, is going to be a lot more difficult than the matchup against Carolina this past week. We're really waiting to hear on the injury concerns of Jaden Daniels. Now, obviously, x-rays came back negative. That's good news. However, maybe they want to rest him. Maybe they want to give him a week or two to get back to 100% instead of throwing him out there and potentially injuring him further. So I'm not one to really handcuff the quarterback position, but if you are solely reliant on Jaden Daniels right now, I'm trying to grab Marcus Mariota just in case. But all right, now let's move on to the running back position where we got Alexander Mattison right here at the top of the list. He's currently 63% owned, a little bit more highly owned than some of these guys, and they have a matchup this week going up against Kansas City. Now, for Alexander Mattison, he is averaging career lows across the board when it comes to efficiency. However, he's touching the football a lot. He's got 17 plus touches now in 3 straight ball games. We know Aiden O'Connell is going to miss the next 4 to 6 weeks, which means we're going back to Gardner Minshew. But the part that really concerns me the most is the matchup this week going up against one of the best run defenses in the NFL, the Kansas City Chiefs. So when it comes to Alexander Mattison, if you can grab him off your waiver wire, it's more of a stash and not an immediate start situation. Now, after Mattison, we go down to Jaylen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's currently 42% owned in a matchup this week going up against the New York Giants, and he's coming off a game in which he saw the most touches he's had in a game this season. Now, he hasn't looked overly explosive, but with Russell Wilson under center, we could be seeing more checkdowns in the near future going the way of Jaylen Warren. No quarterback over the last 2 seasons has checked down more to his running backs than Russell Wilson. Now, it's another one of those situations where we can pick him up and stash him. I don't know if I want to start him immediately in week 8, but could add some great depth for late season runs. After him, we go down to Ray Davis of the Buffalo Bills. He's only 28% owned. I expected that number to be a lot higher. If you don't agree with it, take it up with Sleeper, because that's what they're publishing as of right now. But he's got a matchup going up against Seattle. And obviously, his volume is going to be a lot lower with James Cook being healthy. But when the cold winter months come, they're going to have to run the football more in Buffalo. Having a bruiser like Ray Davis, who's playing great right now, could definitely add some added value to the bottom of your bench for a second half run. But I also have to say this, if you own James Cook, and he's like 100% owned, you should own Ray Davis at this point. If you own James Cook and you don't handcuff him with Ray Davis, don't come complaining to us in week 12 or 13 if you really need him. I hate to stash handcuffs this early in the season, but with the way that the injuries are going, you absolutely have to in 2024. Then we go down to Kendry Miller of the New Orleans Saints. He's only 11% owned in a matchup going up against the Chargers this week. And really, this is more of a speculative ad than really somebody we're going to grab and start as well. With the Saints absolutely sucking right now and having everyone almost be hurt on their roster, there are rumors floating around that Alvin Kamara could be traded at some point. If that happens, Kendry Miller is going to get an increase in volume immediately. Now, I know that Kamara has come out and said, listen, I have not formally requested a trade, but where there's smoke, sometimes there's fire, and Miller could have that extended role down the stretch, just a speculative ad if you have room for him. After him, we go down to Tyler Goodson of the Indianapolis Colts. He's got a matchup going up against Houston, and this one right here is really tied to the health of Jonathan Taylor. If Jonathan Taylor returns, Goodson really isn't fantasy startable for us anymore. However, he is way better than Trey Sermon is. Goodson is a lot more explosive and definitely more of a handcuff going forward for Jonathan Taylor owners. Now, if Taylor were to miss this upcoming week, Goodson will have flex appeal. After him, we go down to Jalen Wright of the Miami Dolphins. He's 19% owned going up against the Arizona Cardinals. And with Tua coming back to this offense, everybody's going to start snagging up Miami weapons once again because we're hoping that he kind of picks up where he left off in Miami and starts putting points back up on the board. This offense has nowhere to go but up. And as of right now, Jalen Wright is one of the lowest owned weapons in that offense. If you got room for him, take a look because they're going up against Arizona this week. A great matchup. And Jalen Wright has actually looked pretty good in his last 2 ball games. But all right, let's move on to 3 other guys. And honestly, we got to handle them a little bit differently because they're actually playing Monday Night Football. All 3 of them are playing tonight. So I don't want to say they're must-adds here on the Waiver Wire show because they may get injured. They may not do anything tonight, but there are names we need to pay attention to. The first one is Kamani Vidal of the Los Angeles Chargers. What is his usage going to look like in a good matchup against Arizona, knowing that Gus Edwards is on IR? We kind of saw Vidal get sprinkled in a little bit last week, and if that increases here this week, he's a name we need to pay attention to as well. How about Sean Tucker? He exploded in week 7, but what is that backfield going to look like with Sean Tucker, Bucky Irving, and Rachaad White? Do they all eat into each other's ceiling? Is it going to be an absolute fantasy nightmare? We need to watch Sean Tucker. And then lastly, it's Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals. We know that James Conner is not 100% healthy. Do they rely a little bit more on Trey Benson, or do they stick with Amari DeMercado? Now, in my opinion, we see Trey Benson as more of that early down guy. DeMercado, more of the third down option, could get some checkdowns. But if I'm trying to find the home run hitter, it's Trey Benson if he's getting the work. If he can come out this week and see right around double-digit touches, he may be somebody we need to pay attention to in week 8 as well. So yeah, a little bit different with 2 games on Monday Night Football, a couple names we got to pay attention to, but now let's move our focus to the wide receiver position. And right here at the top of the list, we got Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers. He's currently 63% owned, but the matchup is great this week going up against Jacksonville. So if he's out there on your waiver wire, you need to try to add him now. It is absolutely impossible, and I mean impossible, to nail down which Green Bay Packer wide receiver is going to go off weekly. We got Jaden Reed, we got Christian Watson, we got Romeo Doubs, we got Dontavian Wicks, and they've all produced at times in this offense this season. However, Romeo Doubs does have 8+ targets now in 2 of his last 3 games, and in a matchup going up against Jacksonville, I absolutely love that. How about Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers? He's only 25% owned in a matchup going up against Dallas. And we talked about this kid all off season long. Now he's overcome being shot. He has returned to the field. We know that we just lost Brandon Ayuk for the season with a torn ACL. We know that Juwan Jennings is currently hurt. And we just saw Ricky Pearsall play 76% of the snaps in his first ever NFL game. He was the second leading wide receiver when it came to targets as well. And we saw a great connection between him and Brock Purdy in the preseason. In fact, I love Ricky Pearsall so much, I'm going to make him my SeatGeek pickup of the week. That's right, we've partnered with SeatGeek, and I'm trying to get you some discounted tickets. Now, every year during Week 18, I take my son to a different stadium. We've been to Atlanta, Miami, Tampa Bay, Washington, Cincinnati, Carolina, and Arizona, but just like everything else right now in the world, things are getting crazy expensive. You gotta try to find a good deal. And that is exactly where SeatGeek comes in. With over 28 million downloads, SeatGeek is the #1 rated ticketing app right now. There are over 70,000 events right now on SeatGeek. It includes concerts, sporting events, festivals, and so much more. They put tickets from all across the web in one place so they can ensure you're getting a good deal. Each ticket is rated on a scale of 1 to 10, so you gotta look for the green dots. Green means good, red means bad. That's right, that's $20 off your first purchase using the promo code Headliner, so make sure you click the link in the description or the pinned comment to download the app and get yourself some discounted tickets right now on SeatGeek. But all right, back to the waiver wire now, where we got Keon Coleman next to the Buffalo Bills. He's currently 52% owned in a matchup going up against the Seattle Seahawks. Now, having Amari Cooper in this offense is greatly going to help the likes of Keon Coleman. We've actually been talking about this kid for weeks on this show, trying to get people to stash him for a late season run. So hopefully a lot of you already have him because it's already starting. He just had a season high in targets, receptions, and yards in week 7. He's no longer the number one guy on the outside. The defensive attention is looking the way of Amari Cooper, which means less defensive attention looking the way of Keon Coleman, more one-on-one coverage, more opportunity for those 50-50 balls where he absolutely excels, and more deep shots down the field. If he's available out there on your waiver wire, he's definitely somebody I'm stashing for the late season run. Then we got Juwan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. He's currently 36% owned going up against Dallas. And maybe he's like a league winner part 2, because he's already come in off the waiver wire at one point this year and put up crazy numbers, but he's been dealing with a hip injury and didn't even play in week 7. We know he's going to have a larger role upon his return for sure, though. With no Brandon Ayuk rest of season and Debo always being banged up, Juwan Jennings is going to be one of the top options in this offense. In fact, if he was 100% healthy right now, he would probably be tops on this list. After him, we go down to Troy Franklin of the Denver Broncos going up against Carolina this week. And the connection between him and Bo Nix is starting to return from college. Don't forget that these two played together in Oregon. And now all of a sudden the connection is starting to heat back up again because Troy Franklin is coming off a season high in targets, receptions, and yards himself. And now a great matchup going up against Carolina. I love that possibility. How about Cedric Tillman in Cleveland? They have a matchup going up against Baltimore, and someone at the wide receiver position needs to catch balls in Cleveland. Jerry Jeudy and Elijah Moore are non-existent. Cedric Tillman is coming off a game in which he just saw 12 targets, had 8 catches for 81 yards. We know that Nick Chubb is still not 100%, but they do want to utilize him on the ground. Now, if Jameis Winston is the quarterback for the rest of the season, we know he likes to sling that rock down the field. Cedric Tillman could be a bench stash for your fantasy football team. Then we also have another guy in San Francisco. It's Jacob Cowing, who is currently 0% owned. And obviously, this one right here is more so of an option if you miss out on Ricky Pearsall or Juwan Jennings. Cowing is not somebody that you're going to be able to plug in right away and expect something from in week 8. However, he is a highly talented wide receiver, and if Juwan Jennings does miss extended time, he would be in line for more targets. So all right, now that we've talked about every wide receiver in San Francisco, let's move on to the tight end position. At the top of the list, we got Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots. He's currently 29% owned in a matchup going up against the Jets, and it is apparent right now that the safest ball catcher in New England with Drake May under center is going to be Hunter Henry. Back-to-back games with at least 10 fantasy points. He's currently the tight end 6 overall. Now, while he isn't going to blow you away with his production, he's a safe weekly tight end as of right now. After him, we got Noah Fant of the Seattle Seahawks. He's 23% owned going up against Buffalo this week. And Noah Fant kind of falls into that quote-unquote safe category. Seattle throws the ball more than anyone else. DK Metcalf is currently banged up with a knee injury right now. And Fant has had at least 8 fantasy points now in back-to-back ball games. And they're looking at him deeper down the field. Why does that matter? Because he doesn't need to rack up a ton of receptions if he's getting the ball thrown to him deeper down the field. A couple big plays a week makes him a safe starting tight end each week for your fantasy football team. Now, after him is another one of those safer options at the tight end position. It's Zach Ertz of the Washington Commanders, currently 42% owned, back-to-back games of 8 fantasy points as well. And if Marcus Mariota is the quarterback under center, he's shown in the past that he likes to utilize his tight ends frequently. He's a little bit more of a safety blanket in that offense. Then we go down to Jonnu Smith of the Miami Dolphins. He's 7% owned in a matchup going up against Arizona, and he has been the best piece of this Miami offense with Tua gone. He was actually the tight end 1 overall just last week. He's had at least 7 targets now in back-to-back games, but he's going to be a little bit hard to trust with Tua returning. With so many other options in this offense like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, guys that we've seen Tua rely on in the past, Jonnu Smith is a little bit more of a shot in the dark, but if they continue to utilize him like they have the past couple weeks, he could be a pleasant surprise. And then lastly is Jatavian Sanders of the Carolina Panthers. He's only 7% owned right now going up against the Denver Broncos, another guy we've talked about here for a couple weeks. He's not a huge producer, but if we know one thing, it's that the Carolina Panthers are going to be losing weekly and having to throw the football. Jatavian Sanders has had at least 6 targets now in back-to-back ball games, so if you're desperate, he's an option. Which then really only leaves us some defensive special teams units that we can pick up to stream here in week 8. The first one, the Denver Broncos. They're the highest owned of the group here at 71%, but they have that matchup going up against Carolina. They're the number 2 overall defense in fantasy football right now in a great matchup at home against Carolina. I honestly have no idea why they're not 100% owned. Just go check your waiver wire. If they're there for whatever reason, snag them for this week. Then we got the Detroit Lions. They're only 15% owned in a matchup going up against Tennessee. Another top 12 fantasy defense, despite Minnesota going out there last week and hanging 29 points on them. Now they're going to get a matchup going up against Tennessee with Mason Rudolph. Add in the fact that this is a home game in Detroit. They're a great option for week 8. How about the Chargers defense? They're 36% owned in a matchup going up against New Orleans. Now, obviously, they're playing tonight, so we have no idea what's going to happen there, but they are another top 12 fantasy defense that now gets a great matchup against a horrible offense in the New Orleans Saints. And then lastly, the Kansas City Chiefs. They're 35% owned. They're going up against the Las Vegas Raiders in week 8. Now, the Chiefs have a fairly average fantasy defense, but with a matchup going up against Las Vegas and their minimal weapons on the offensive side of the football, week 8, the Chiefs could be a decent streaming option. So all right, that does the waiver wire. Now let's talk about 5 players that I'm dropping if I own them in fantasy football. The first one is Xavier Legette of the Carolina Panthers. He's currently 41% owned. He is an electric playmaker, but they just do not force him the ball enough. He's only had 1 fantasy startable game all year long. After him, Jerome Ford. He's 52% owned. Cleveland showed that they want to get Nick Chubb involved as quickly as humanly possible, and that's going to happen, especially after the injury to Deshaun Watson. With Jerome Ford injured and Pierre Strong getting touches, I'm not wasting the bench spot if there's a better option to pick up. Then Trey Sermon. He's 45% owned. Not interested anymore. Goodson has definitely taken that job away from him, and with JT nearing return, we don't need Trey Sermon. How about Colby Parkinson, the tight end of the Los Angeles Rams? He's 35% owned as of right now. Cooper Kupp is coming back, and the availability in this offense for more targets is only going down weekly for Parkinson. And then lastly, Calvin Ridley. He's 67% owned, and targets are great, but they're not great if they're not catchable, and Mason Rudolph absolutely sucks. Calvin Ridley has only 5 catches over the last month of the season, and no touchdowns since week 2. I would rather have someone else with more upside that we talked about earlier in the show. So that'll do it for the week 8 waiver wire show. Now, obviously, there may be some other players out there that you have questions about. If that's the case, just leave a comment down below, and I'll try to respond to as many as I possibly can. Now, if you haven't done so already, now is the time to hit the like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.